Hello and welcome to this instructional video of the Nebraska Realtors Association regarding recent revisions to the exclusive buyer's agency form agreement. My name is Ann Post. I'm an attorney at Rumble Ludke Law Firm, and I serve as general counsel for the Nebraska Realtors Association. So first, let me provide some context for this video. This is an instructional video regarding recent revisions to the exclusive buyer's agency form agreement of the Nebraska Realtors Association. This video and this form do not serve as legal advice. This form cannot fit the terms of every transaction. If there are any questions of terms for your transaction or the need for an individualized agreement, please seek individual legal counsel to ensure that any agreement signed accurately reflects the needs and the terms agreed to by all parties. Next, let's move to the agreement itself. In front of us is the exclusive buyer's agency agreement as revised. The first revision you'll note at the very top of the agreement. This is the statement that buyer acknowledges that realtor commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable. Anyone on this call, I'm sure, is familiar that this has always been the case. But with this revision, this is one of the first terms of the agreement. It is one of the first things that greets the buyer when they start their review of this agreement to ensure that the buyer is fully aware that commissions are fully negotiable. So with that, let's move down the agreement. In our first paragraph, we define the parties to the agreement and really break out for clarity each party to the agreement. This includes the buyer, the brokerage, and the individual agent. As we move down the paragraph, we'll note in the last sentence where we've defined the term realtor to include both the brokerage and the individual agent. And then that definition and that defined term are going to carry through the rest of the agreement. As we move to paragraph 1, you will note this is the exclusive buyer's agency agreement. That means this form should be used when the buyer's agent is the only agent acting on behalf of a buyer. And that's covered in paragraph 1, where the buyer is granting that agent that exclusive right to handle all negotiations on their behalf. As we move to paragraph 2, this sets out the term of the agreement. Pursuant to Nebraska law, any buyer's agency agreement has to have a defined beginning and end, and all renewals must be in a writing signed by each party. So this paragraph 2 is reflective of that law and reflective of previous versions of buyer's agency agreements. As we move to paragraph 3, again, this refers to that exclusive representation. This requires the buyer to represent and warrant and provide assurances to the buyer's agent that they are, in fact, the only agent acting on behalf of that buyer. That moves us quickly into paragraph 4, and this is really where we will see the bulk of revisions to this agreement as opposed to previous versions of the buyer's exclusive agency agreement. Paragraph 4 covers compensation paid. You will note that under this paragraph, we have structured 4 different types of compensation with the ability to clarify exactly which ones apply to which representation. So as we move down, we have options A, B, C, and D. A contemplates compensation as a percentage of the gross sales price of a property. B contemplates fixed compensation. C deals with any broker's administrative commission. And finally, with D, we have other. I will say, please be cautious as you use other. Ensure that any other compensation arrangement entered into complies with Nebraska licensing law and the requirements of any ethics obligations. So for example, when filling out this paragraph, if the agent and their buyer have agreed to a compensation as a percentage of the gross sales price and a broker's administrative commission, they would fill in those numbers in lines A and C, and then in the body of paragraph 4 in the blank, list A and C. So to recap, in that scenario, at the end of once fully completed, paragraph 4 would read, buyer agrees to pay compensation to realtor for professional services rendered as shown in paragraphs, and they would have filled in A and C below, with A and C having been completed with the numbers and any flat fee agreed to between the parties. As we move down paragraph 4, the next paragraph deals with when that compensation is paid. The first and foremost is that compensation is payable upon the closing of the purchase of the property. Nebraska licensing law requires that payment be made only on termination of representation or the close and purchase of a property, which is why this obligation is carried through in this paragraph 4. The next part of this paragraph 4 deals with the scenario where perhaps a buyer's representative has toured a property with a buyer, given the buyer lots of options, but they don't sign the agreement until after the termination of the representation agreement. So in this case, this language specifically states that if the representation agreement has terminated and a purchase agreement is signed within a set number of days, or if the buyer closes on a property that was shown to them by the buyer's agent, or that was brought to their attention by the buyer's agent, and they close on the property within a set number of days, compensation is still owed to that buyer's agent. Now you will note that I keep saying a set number of days. This is because those are blanks to be filled in this agreement. These blanks and how long that is appropriate for that number of days really is dependent on your market conditions and what is appropriate in your individualized market. So that was paragraph 4. Let's move on to paragraph 5. This is the bolded paragraph, you will note. We'll scroll up a little bit. This is our bolded paragraph, compensation disclosure. Here, we've got paragraphs A, B, and C. Let's move to 5A first. This paragraph deals with net compensation. You will note that every subsection of this paragraph does require the buyer's initials. Net compensation deals with what happens when there's an offer of compensation. Under paragraph 4, the buyer has already agreed to compensate their buyer's agent. Under paragraph 5A, it's clarified that if there is an offer of compensation, if the seller's agent is offering to pay the buyer's agent some compensation, that the buyer's agent can accept that, and that will offset the buyer's obligation to pay the buyer's agent. Next, we move on to paragraph 5B. This adds additional clarity. This is what we've called our make-whole provision. This clarifies what happens in the scenario where there is an offer of compensation and the seller's agent is offering to compensate the buyer's agent, but that offer of compensation is not as much as the buyer has already agreed to pay their buyer's agent. So in the scenario where the offer of compensation is less than the buyer has agreed to pay their agent, in this case, the buyer is obligated to make up the difference. So this is clarified in that paragraph 5B, the make-whole provision, and this is required to have the buyer initial this section. Finally, we move down to paragraph 5C, compensation limits. Again, this requires the buyer's initial. What this clarifies is that the buyer's agent cannot accept more compensation than stated in paragraph 4 above. So for example, if there is, again, a seller's agent offers compensation, but that compensation is above the compensation the buyer's agent has agreed to in paragraph 4, the buyer's agent can only accept at maximum the amount agreed to in paragraph 4. So that moves us through paragraph 5, compensation disclosure, and moves us down to paragraph 6, failure to close. This is very similar to previous versions of this paragraph under previous agreements. It acknowledges that if there is a purchase agreement that fails to close through no fault of the buyer, compensation is waived and the buyer's agent will not receive a compensation. However, if the buyer refuses to close for a reason that isn't a clear contingency under their agreement, it's just their refusal to close, the compensation will still be owed to the buyer's agent. Finally, that moves us to paragraph 7. This is, again, a new paragraph to this agreement. This is a termination clause. This paragraph allows either the buyer or their representative to terminate this agreement upon 10 days written notice to the other. So in this scenario where buyer and agent have started working together, and maybe it's clear that there just isn't a good fit between the two, either can terminate the agreement on 10 days notice. However, I will still note that this termination clause does refer back to that compensation clause in paragraph 4. What that means is that If the contract is just terminated upon notice, but the buyer still proceeds to buy a property that was shown to them by the realtor, that there would still be the obligation to pay compensation in accordance with paragraph 4. So that moves us down to our next page. This page will all look very familiar to you. Again, these are the duties of an agent under state law that are required as terms of any buyer's agency agreement. First, we have our dual agency disclosure stating that if a dual agency situation arises, that the buyer will be notified. We have paragraphs 9 and 10 that detail the duties of a buyer's agent and a seller's agent to their client. Our disclosure of motivating factors, confidential information, and additional paragraphs that are, again, you should all be familiar with and have not been materially changed from previous versions of this agreement. So that takes us through the revisions to this exclusive buyer's agency agreement. Thank you for your time. We appreciate you sticking through to watch this video. It is our pleasure to provide you these resources by both the Nebraska Realtors Association and Frimble Lidke Law Firm. Thank you.